Imagine a night without electric light, only the wind sweeping through the tents. In the middle of the camp, someone utters a name too vast to fit inside a mouth. YHWH. The sound spreads like an ember. For some, it is the name of the creator of all things. For others, it is merely the banner of a desert clan. Stories tell that this god walked with men, ate at the same table, and wrote laws in stone. But the stories of neighboring peoples say the same about their own gods. So who was Yahweh when the sky was still crowded with many? Our path today is simple and bold: to step away from ready-made discourse, to press our ear against the sources, and to listen to what the Bible, archaeology, and neighboring religions whisper when no one is shouting. Because in the layers of time, each people kept a fragment of the same voice, and perhaps together, these fragments tell something greater than the name itself. The story begins in Canaan, a land teeming with altars and names: Baal, Astarte, Asherah, El. Each ruled over an aspect of life: harvest, rain, love, thunder. Among them, a still timid name: Yahweh. A tribal god perhaps, a god of the south, invoked by nomads who wandered through dust and fear. Excavations by modern archaeologists brought to light a stone darkened by time, the Moabite Stone, dated to around 830 BC. There, among the lines of an ancient king, the tetragram YHWH appears for the first time carved in stone. Not a myth, but an inscription, a record of flesh and history. And before that, long before, the Egyptians already spoke of the Shasu of Yahu, desert nomads mentioned in 14th century BC documents, enemies of Pharaoh Amenhotep III. For some, this would be the first trace of the worship of Yahweh. For others, merely a phonetic coincidence. But when coincidence repeats for millennia, it ceases to be chance and becomes a vestige. The Old Testament shows Yahweh descending to earth, speaking, demanding. In Genesis, he converses with Abraham. In Exodus, he appears to Moses on Mount Sinai, where the ground trembles and fire writes commandments. A God who arises in the desert, but also a God with territory, with preferences, with jealousy. And in that jealousy lies the mystery. For among the ancient Canaanites, there was another God, El, the father of the gods, the chief of the pantheon, and his sons were called Elohim. The Bible uses the same term, Elohim, to refer to Yahweh. Coincidence? Inheritance? Perhaps the name God was born from a fusion of memories, El and Yahweh, combined, shaping a new divine face. In the beginning, the Israelites were few, a small people struggling to survive among empires, but their deity grew with them, ceasing to be a tribal god and becoming the voice that moves heavens and seas. And over time, Yahweh absorbed the other gods, not by the sword, but by belief. The ancient sons of El became angels, the old gods became messengers, and polytheism slowly bowed before monotheism. The story of Yahweh is also the story of the forgetting of other gods. But every erased memory leaves a shadow, and in the shadows of archaeology, on the tablets of Ugarit, in the ruins of Phoenicia, we can see the outline of this God still in formation, part man, part myth, part truth. Yahweh begins to become unique, not because he always was, but because he needed to be. Amid empires, wars, and exiles, the Israelite people found strength in a single name, and thus the God of the desert became the God of the cosmos, God of all. But before being everything, he was someone. Yahweh, before being the God of the heavens, was the God of a valley, a name whispered on dusty nights, a presence that walked among tents, that made itself heard in thunder and promises. He was the God of a small people, and perhaps that is the reason for his strength. While empires raised temples of marble, the Israelites carried their God in heart and word. And when exile came, when Jerusalem was destroyed, and the temple turned to ash, they discovered something no stone could contain, that the divine needs no dwelling. It was in that moment, amid ruins and longing, that Yahweh ceased to be only the God of Israel and became the God of all places. Faith that once depended on an altar now depended on a memory, and the name forbidden to be spoken began to echo within the silence of each person. Perhaps that is why he survived, because a name carved in stone can be broken, but a name carved in the mind keeps breathing. Archaeology shows the record, the Bible shows the belief, but what sustains the myth is time, that invisible sculptor that turns the historical into the sacred. And at the crossroads between science and faith, the question echoes again: who is Yahweh? An ancient god of the deserts, a symbol of a people's power, or a cosmic force that merely revealed itself under different names to civilizations barely aware of each other? The desert still holds the echo of that question. Perhaps, if we listen closely, we can hear the same wind Abraham heard when he decided to follow a faceless voice. A voice that somehow still speaks, not from above, but from within. If there is a point where myth touches the real, it lies in the ruins. Among the fragments of stone and clay, Yahweh appears not as a distant god, but as part of a landscape populated by other gods, kings, and rituals. And it is here that the question takes form. Was Yahweh the supreme God from the beginning? Or did he become one, shaped by time and by the need of a people searching for a center? The biblical texts tell one story, but the tablets of Ugarit tell another. There in the north of ancient Canaan, the Phoenicians recorded the pantheon of their gods: El, the celestial chief; Baal, the lord of storms; Astarte, the lady of love and fertility. And there were also the sons of El, lesser divinities, who served under his authority. This model of the cosmos, one supreme God and his servants, strongly echoes in the earliest Israelite traditions. But the prophets, centuries later, would try to erase this inheritance, transforming the council of gods into a court of angels. When Moses climbs Sinai and meets Yahweh, he does not just climb a mountain, he climbs an idea that the divine can be singular, total, indivisible. But even that revelation carries the echo of older voices. The Babylonians had Marduk, who also defeated chaos and ordered the world. The Egyptians had Amun-Ra, the sun that rises above all gods. And in Sumer, before all, there were Enlil, lord of the winds, and Enki, the god of waters and wisdom, beings who descended from the skies to teach men, to create laws and civilizations. In every culture, there is always a God who descends, one who speaks, who guides, who promises. The difference is the name, and perhaps the name is only the disguise of the same human impulse to find meaning in the invisible forces that govern the world. When Abraham hears the voice of Yahweh, he is in the city of Ur of the Chaldeans, one of the oldest in Sumer. Excavations show temples, ziggurats, priests watching the stars in search of messages. It is possible that Abraham grew up seeing men offering gifts to gods who came from the sky. So when a new voice calls him, he already knows the language of faith. He only changes the addressee. And thus, the myth moves, not as a lie, but as translation. Each generation translates the divine into its own language, its own pain, its own hope. The God of Abraham is not the same God of Moses. The one of Moses is not the same as David's. The one of David already begins to resemble the universal God of the prophets. And the one of Jesus speaks of a Father who needs neither temples nor vengeance, only presence. But to understand Yahweh in his full dimension, one must look beyond the Bible. The archaeology of ideas reveals something fascinating. No matter how much the sacred texts tried to separate the divine from the human, Yahweh behaves like a profoundly human being. He feels jealousy, anger, regret. He argues, negotiates, punishes, consoles. These emotions are not weaknesses. They are traits of a divinity born among real people, in a time when heaven and earth still conversed without intermediaries. And as monotheism takes hold, Yahweh ceases to appear in physical form. The voice becomes distant. The God who once walked among tents now speaks through prophets, then through texts, then through silence. What was once visible becomes invisible. What was once personal becomes cosmic. And in this disappearance, modern faith is born. The belief in a God who no longer needs to descend because he is in everything. But the echo of ancient traditions never vanished. The Babylonians spoke of the Anunnaki, beings who came from the heavens to teach mankind. The Egyptians told of Thoth, the god of wisdom, who gave humans writing and knowledge. In Greece, Hermes Trismegistus would be the messenger between worlds. And in Israel, Yahweh would give Moses the Kabbalah, the mystical knowledge that deciphers the very structure of the universe. Perhaps these are different ways of narrating the same primordial gesture, the descent of the divine to teach the human, the hand of the invisible touching the clay of creation. Thus, the story of Yahweh is not only about a God who reveals himself to a people, but about how a people learns to see God. He is mirror and reflection, teacher and enigma. And the more we study him, the more he seems to change shape, as if he were always one step ahead of human understanding. Because perhaps the mystery of Yahweh lies not in who he is, but in who invokes him, in the man who calls him by name, and who, in doing so, creates God himself in his own image and likeness. There is a moment in human history when the sacred stops looking outward and begins to look inward. It is the moment when man realizes he is not only a creature, but also a mirror of creation. Yahweh, the God who once spoke through thunder, begins to speak through thought. The fire of Sinai fades, and the fire of consciousness ignites. Since then, the forbidden name has ceased to be carved in stone and has come to dwell in breath, every time someone inhales and exhales in silence. The sound of Yahweh is, after all, the sound of one's own breath, life pronouncing the divine without realizing it. When we look at the timeline, we see the full journey, the tribal God who becomes a universal God, a historical figure that turns into an idea, and an idea that dissolves into the human experience of mystery. And at the same time, we see the reverse, the man who realizes himself as creator, responsible for naming the unnameable, and sustaining, through faith, the invisible. Perhaps that is what distinguishes the Yahweh of ancient texts from the Yahweh of modern prayers. Before, he walked upon the dust and spoke face to face. Today, he moves between the lines of consciousness. Faith evolves, but the desire remains the same, to understand where we come from and what watches us when the sky falls silent. Science calls it origin, philosophy calls it cause, faith calls it God. They are names for the same pulsing absence. And the name Yahweh in Hebrew comes from the verb to be. It does not describe a form, but a state. It is the I am, the purest verb, the one that exists without needing proof. When Jesus speaks of the Father, he speaks of this essence, not of a being in heaven, but of the force that inhabits everything. And perhaps that is why he was so rejected. He did not speak of a God who takes vengeance, but of a God who breathes. The same Yahweh who descended in fire on Sinai now manifests in the stillness of every soul that seeks meaning. And here the story closes, but it does not end, because the name changes, but the mystery remains. Yahweh, Allah, El, Brahman, the All. Each culture merely turned the kaleidoscope and saw a different face of the same light. The divine is the mirror that reflects according to the gaze, and man, in his thirst for truth, does not seek gods. He seeks the reflection of himself when he finally understands that he too is part of the infinite. Perhaps that is what distinguishes the Yahweh of ancient texts from the Yahweh of modern prayers. Before, he walked upon the dust and spoke face to face. Today, he moves between the lines of consciousness. Faith evolves, but the desire remains the same, to understand where we come from and what watches us when the sky falls silent. Science calls it origin, philosophy calls it cause, faith calls it God. They are names for the same pulsing absence. And the name Yahweh in Hebrew comes from the verb to be. It does not describe a form, but a state. It is the I am, the purest verb, the one that exists without needing proof. When Jesus speaks of the Father, he speaks of this essence, not of a being in heaven, but of the force that inhabits everything. And perhaps that is why he was so rejected. He did not speak of a God who takes vengeance, but of a God who breathes. The same Yahweh who descended in fire on Sinai now manifests in the stillness of every soul that seeks meaning. And here the story closes, but it does not end, because the name changes, but the mystery remains. Yahweh, Allah, El, Brahman, the All. Each culture merely turned the kaleidoscope and saw a different face of the same light. The divine is the mirror that reflects according to the gaze, and man, in his thirst for truth, does not seek gods. He seeks the reflection of himself when he finally understands that he too is part of the infinite. Perhaps the secret of Yahweh was never his power, but his humanity. He was the first mirror in which humanity recognized itself. And that is why he survived, because as long as man exists, there will be someone pronouncing the name of the being that makes him exist, even without realizing it, even in silence, even when all that remains is the wind over the desert.